Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Saturday, April 5th, we're in Sackville, New Brunswick with Dr. Andrew Vayda, Pete. I wonder if you can tell us a bit about your early education.
Well, beginning with college, or before, most of my early education was in New York City, in public schools. There was 1 year in Budapest before I went with my mother from Hungary to the United States. And thereafter, it was elementary school and high school in New York City, followed by Columbia College, and then Columbia University. I received a bachelor's degree and PhD from Columbia University.
In what fields?
I was a pre-law student in Columbia College, and I went for 1 day to Columbia Law School and realized that it wasn't really what I wanted to do, and then took a year of, actually it was my senior year of college, because Columbia at that time had an option whereby you could do 1 year of professional school as your senior year. Mm-hmm. And when I tried law school, I realized I wasn't sure this was for me, and took a lot of anthropology courses, and that decided me on going into anthropology.
Mm-hmm. What ideas or events were influential for you during that time?
During that period of my education? Well, I think I was looking for some big ideas that would explain the world for me.
Mm-hmm. And how did you come up with the dissertation topic? What did you decide to do in the end?
Well, let me jump back. Before that, the appeal was one teacher I had, Elman Service, who was a follower of Leslie White, mm-hmm. who had a pretty comprehensive view of what makes the world tick. And that had appeal because I was young and in some ways confused and didn't know what a career in law would hold for me. So this was a good alternative. And although that was an early influence, it didn't really stick with me very long. When I got into graduate school, we had a fairly lively group of students who were challenging ideas we were getting from some of our teachers. And the idea for my dissertation really came from a dissertation that Marshall Solins, who was 1 year ahead of me, had been working on, which was relating Polynesian social structure to productivity. And I had become interested in warfare by that time. So I thought a follow-up to that, looking at Polynesian warfare in a comparative way and relating that to both social organization and productivity of food resources would be interesting. And I proposed to do a dissertation research, much as Solins had done. Mm-hmm. And I secured a Fulbright scholarship to New Zealand to work on that, and I knew that the Turnbull Library in Wellington had very good library resources. And when I got the Fulbright scholarship, I went to New Zealand, affiliated with the University of Auckland, but working mostly in Wellington. Mm-hmm. on what was originally supposed to be a comparative study of Polynesian warfare, similar to the comparative study that Marshall Solins had done. But I found the material on Maoris much superior to the material on other Polynesian societies, so I concentrated my efforts on getting data on Maori warfare. And I pulled together a lot of material and brought that back to New York to my dissertation committee without anything much on other Polynesian societies. And this was a great disappointment to them because it wasn't comparative and it wasn't sufficiently theoretical. And Columbia University at that time is probably most American universities where anthropology was taught as emphasized very much having a theoretical orientation. This was the case not only in anthropology but in most fields. Mm-hmm. So I think this was the beginning of something I laid aside afterwards, but it was the beginning of great respect for evidence and a concern with actual behavior rather than with more elaborate kinds of theoretical constructs. But I was sort of waylaid in subsequent years and got very involved with elaborate theoretical constructs. And gained some reputation for doing so, favorable reputation.
Who was your dissertation advisor?
Well, originally I was working with Elman Service, who had impressed me with Leslie White's work, but Service had also worked with Julian Stewart and in a way combined the two. And it was maybe indirectly through Service that I received the focus on environment in relation to people and culture that was very central to Julian Stewart's work. Stewart had been at Columbia but left the year before I became a graduate student. So he did have an indirect influence on me. But then Stewart moved to the Service moved to the University of Michigan, and Morton Freed, who was a China expert, became my dissertation advisor. And then when I had difficulty with the dissertation I was proposing to do after returning from New Zealand, difficulty because I didn't have comparative material and didn't have sufficient theoretical focus. And after initial dissertation defense, I was asked to rework the dissertation. Margaret Mead became central on the committee, and I worked intensively with her, and that was fruitful. And subsequently, when I became a member of the Columbia faculty, all these people were colleagues.
Can I ask you how you would describe the relationship of your work to Leslie White and Julian Stewart's? How would you describe the relationship of your work to theirs?
To what?
How would you describe the relationship of your work to Julian Stewart and Leslie White's?
In late 1960s, Roy Rappaport and I wrote an article quite critical of Stewart because he made culture the unit that is trying to relate to the environment. And Rappaport, who'd been a student of mine at Columbia, and I had been reading a lot of the literature of ecology from which we drew the notion that it would be better to talk about populations and ecosystems in relation to, the interrelations of populations and ecosystems, as some biologists or ecologists were doing, but instead of looking at animal or plant populations, we could look at human populations. So we were proposing to talk about human populations in relation to their environment. And we wrote an article which had considerable impact at the time called Ecology, Cultural or Non-Cultural. And we came out on the side of non-cultural ecology, but subsequently it was widely hailed as an important work in cultural ecology. Those things happen. But for a long time I was called a cultural ecologist. But it's okay, I mean, labels don't bother me now. They used to bother me.
Can I get you to talk a little bit about your early career after you graduated, I guess, with your PhD from Columbia?
Well, I did believe in field work. I also believe that library research was a good way of moving on with one's career, because the hope was that I would be able to complete a dissertation in a year or so and then get out into the field. It took me 2 years, but still I received a PhD at a fairly early age. I was 24 at the time. I got the PhD. And I was pleased by that because I wanted to get away from the university. So I got a grant to do field work in the Cook Islands with the initial idea of comparing society and culture and environment in two closely related atolls, Manihiki and Rakahanga. And in the course of the field work, when I felt the need for more comparative material, I moved on to the atoll of Puka Puka. And I spent a year in those 3 atolls and produced, I think, 3 or 4 articles on them, which some of my teachers and mentors, including ones I met, not directly as teachers, but for example Raymond Firth, whom I spent a summer with at London School of Economics, felt that there should have been a full-scale monograph on those people, but I didn't find the material justify that. And I've been criticized for that.
How did you find the experience of fieldwork itself? Did you enjoy it?
Oh, tremendously. Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you did?
There, in those 3 atolls, I'd rather talk about the subsequent field work.
Tell me about that
The problem with that field work is that I was trying to follow the model in vogue at the time, where you pick a society and you describe it. You do an ethnography of it. And that's the kind of field work I didn't enjoy then, and I don't think I ever enjoyed or ever could enjoy, because I needed more of a specific focus. So when I moved on to field work, where I was trying to get answers to specific questions that I found much more satisfactory. The earlier experience I found satisfactory from a living standpoint. I enjoyed living on the coral atolls and interacting with the people and learning various things about them and eating fish and going out in canoes to fish with them and so forth. But I wasn't excited by anything I was finding out about them. it may have been just a poor choice of society. I remember talking with Douglas Oliver, an anthropologist who was long at Harvard and then at the University of Hawaii. And he had been doing fieldwork in the Polynesian islands, and particularly in Tahiti, and produced some important works on Tahiti. But I remember saying there isn't the kind of thrill of ethnographic discovery that one gets from working in societies which had been not as long in contact with Western civilization. So when one is trying to do complete ethnographies, there would be this kind of thrill of ethnographic discovery, as he called it, where you were finding out things that nobody knew, nobody had expected. And we had some of that subsequently when we did research in New Guinea, in societies that had, or with groups that had first been contacted just a few years before I and my colleagues arrived there. But then we also had a focus on warfare and land use and so forth.
I think that's an interesting idea, that working in a society that has had relatively little contact with the West gives you this, real intellectual drive and curiosity to find out something that nobody else knows. And it sounds like that's what you're talking about when in your later field work and you were looking at a specific topic, that gave you that same drive and intellectual curiosity.
But in the later field work, I wasn't trying to do an ethnography of a society. There I was trying to answer much more specific questions. But it was a satisfaction in curiosity as a drive,
Can you talk about the different themes that have interested you over your career?
Well, the theme of relation between people and their environment, which I first got as a graduate student at Columbia, indirectly through Julian Stewart's influence, but through a lot of my own reading on the subject and interactions with other teachers and students, that's remained. But it's taken different forms at different stages of my career. Initially, when there were battles going on in anthropology about how to account for cultural similarities and differences, one faction, one school held that environment or ecological influences were important. And I suppose I'm more or less inclined to that view. I try to refine it in various ways. And in the 60s, I was involved in developing what subsequently came to be called neo-functional ecological anthropology, where it wasn't a simple matter of environmental determinism, ecological determinism, but more a matter of looking at systems which include human and unhuman components working together to maintain some kind of long-term stability in how the system as a whole related to the environment. So that was interesting to me at the time, but it's in line with the general people-environment theme. And some of the work that came out of that period was influential at the time. I've disowned most of it, I mean all of it really, but the interest in asking questions about the relation between people and environment has continued, but has taken different form in my more recent work.
Why do you say that you've disowned that work?
Why did I disown it, or why do I say I disowned it?
Both.
Well, I say I disowned it because I did. I've written articles recanting it, although if you Google my name, you'll still find that I'm giving credit for views that I haven't held for about 40 years. I think it just didn't work. They didn't work. They were. It was wishful thinking and flights of theoretical fancy and so on. And when I looked more closely at data, but not only that, when I considered more closely the logic of analysis and so on, I think those views didn't hold up. And much more could be said about that, but it was a long time ago. But I'm happy to go on record saying that I no longer believe a lot of that, and I haven't believed it for about 40 years. No, 40? Yeah, about 40.
So what do you believe
We brought
now?
out some articles in the 1970s. For example, I collaborated with Bonnie McKay, who was then a student of mine and subsequently became a colleague at Rutgers. An article called New Directions in Ecology and Ecological Anthropology, which came out, I think, in 1974 in Annual Reviews of Anthropology. And that was maybe the first publication in which we were indicating, or I was indicating, my disenchantment with some of the ideas to which I subscribed earlier.
Can you talk a little bit then about the relationship between, I guess, theory and fieldwork in your mind?
I could, but may I say I'd rather not?
Sure.
I'd rather talk about theory and methodology and fieldwork. I think too much has been made of theory per se, and along with that, there goes making too much of the relation between theory and fieldwork. I think there has to be much more attention to methodology in the philosopher's sense of analysis of the concepts, practices and logic underlying research in a particular field. And, rather than just tools and techniques, which for many anthropologists and people in other fields is what methodology means, but I'm using it more in this other sense. And I think there are very important relations between fieldwork, or library research for that matter, in getting questions answered. But you have to get sort of straightened out on your methodology in order to do that properly. Now, theory indicates in often important ways, the questions that are worth asking and also possible answers to them. But for the last couple of decades at least, the emphasis in my work has been much more on getting questions answered than contributing to theory. And the questions can be general ones, so some people would think of them as theoretical questions, but that's not an issue for me. I mean, the questions could be questions going from my most recent work. What are the causes of tropical moist? What are the causes of forest fires in tropical moist areas? Those tropical moist forest fires, what are their causes? I've done work on causes of warfare, which some people might think of as a theoretical question, but the last answers I've given to that question have consisted of breaking up the question to many more specific and sharply focused questions and giving answers to them, like questions about what are the consequences of warfare in either particular societies or under particular circumstances, what are the motivations of the warriors, etc., etc. And we can give answers to those questions, which are different, the different questions and answers than would be the case if we were asking for a general theory of warfare.
So this is part 2 of my interview with Andrew Peter Vayda. It's April 5th, 2008 in Sackville, New Brunswick. I guess I wanted to ask about your move from Columbia to Rutgers. Can you tell me about that?
Well, maybe I should mention I first moved to Columbia in 1960 after my first teaching job at the University of British Columbia, which a job that lasted 2 years. I was replacing other people. And actually at the time I had the ambition of being a kind of journeyman anthropologist and going to lots of different places in the world, but I couldn't resist the invitation to my alma mater. And I spent 10 years there, no, 12 years. And initially it was a very exciting place to be at. There was a lot of intellectual ferment going on. Marvin Harris was developing his ideas, which led to his massive and quite influential book, Rise of Anthropological Theory. We had visitors like Frederick Barth, who did have positive influence on my thinking. And Morton Fried, who'd been my supervisor, was still there, and a number of other interesting people and good students. And I enjoyed the initial years there, but with the particular interest I had in interrelations of people in their environment, I felt constrained in my ability to work across disciplinary lines, and my disillusionment with systems thinking had begun, and my questioning of the materialist dogma, I should perhaps say, espoused by Marvin Harris towards the end of that period had also begun. So I began to look for positions elsewhere, and the one at Rutgers appealed to me because it was a senior position in what had been the College of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences, which was looking at the time for a new identity as a multi-purpose liberal arts college with a so-called man and environment theme. and then they invited me to join them and to take a leading role in developing that. So I thought this was an opportunity to put into practice some of the ideas I had about working in a more interdisciplinary way, or perhaps ignoring disciplinary boundaries so as to advance knowledge, understanding, explanation in this general area of people-environment interactions. So although I was a full professor at Columbia at the time, I did move to Rutgers, and after I was there just a few months, the central administration prevailed upon me to become a dean. And then I thought this would be a further opportunity to put into practice some of the ideas I had about getting away from some of the constraints of disciplinary bound teaching, thinking, research. And to a limited extent, perhaps I succeeded, but much less than I expected. And all the other administrators, I think, were disappointed in what they got from me. And after 2 years, were happy to let me loose back into the academic world. But more than that, they gave me a degree of freedom, which perhaps not many academics had. And for a few years, I could take advantage of grants from UNESCO and other agencies to work on problems of deforestation and related issues in Indonesia. And I did that on a sort of occasional basis by means of trips to Indonesia and participation in conferences in various places, mostly sponsored by UNESCO's Man and Biosphere program. But then beginning in 79-80, we had a series of longer-term projects to look at the forces making for deforestation on Kalimantan or Borneo. And those experiences were important to me as fieldwork experiences, which you asked about previously, but these were different from the fieldwork experiences which were directed to getting the ethnography of particular societies. We were trying to answer questions about deforestation, and it wasn't the role of a particular group or society in deforestation, but rather we were trying to understand the various forces contributing to it, and taking cues from my earlier thinking and influences like, I guess, Frederick Marx and some others who were inclined to focus more on events and actions than on systems. We proceeded to design research accordingly, so that we were asking, what does deforestation mean in more specific terms? Well, it means people cutting down trees. So if it means people cutting down trees, we want to see who is cutting down trees, and we want to focus our research on them. And that's in fact what we did. And we found various groups involved in deforestation and had a number of sub-projects which were focused on looking intensively at the activities of those groups. And that was sort of a significant break from what had been more traditional ways, anthropological ways of proceeding. It also was multi-sided research before that became a fashionable term for so-called postmodern anthropologists. It was multi-sided because the problem was multi-sided, so we had to look for answers in a number of different sites. So that I think was a significant contribution of fieldwork to my thinking, going back to the question you had asked in the first part. of the interview.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that Indonesian part of your life, your Indonesian fieldwork? Your Indonesian fieldwork.
Well, went on for some time in different ways. After the UNESCO MAB project, I was in Indonesia again in 1989-90 as a Fulbright professor at the University of Indonesia. And as part of that period, we had a project where we joined a program on integrated pest management in Central Java, and we're asking about the acceptance of Central Javanese people of integrated pest management programs. And there again we were applying an approach where the focus was on actions and events in relation to the environment. And some publications came out of that, and I was working mostly with Indonesian students who were doing most of the actual field research, but when some years later I was asked to contribute a volume on local knowledge, and that experience turned out to be significant, and with a couple of collaborators, I wrote an article in which we questioned the view of local knowledge studies whereby whole knowledge systems, or so-called local knowledge or indigenous knowledge systems, have to be understood for their relevance to questions of development, conservation, and so forth. And we argued in that paper, which was published in 2004, that we need to have a much more specific focus on the actions which are of interest because of their environmental effects, and then we have to ask what is the knowledge behind those actions which leads people to take part in those actions, rather than asking what is the totality in some sense of the knowledge system which is behind the actions. I don't know how much sense that makes, but I have plans to republish that article under the title On Knowing What Not to Know About Knowing, which unfortunately sounds a little like a pronouncement of our former U.S. Secretary of Defense, but if you think about the words, they're defensible and provocative and interesting. And then, as I said, more recently I was involved in research on the causes of fires in tropical moist forests in Indonesia. And that's research I first got into in 98, because there were the extensive forest fires in Indonesia during the El Nino event of 1997-98. And I had plans for the summer of 98 to do a little consulting work in the Arun Valley of Nepal, together with a Norwegian research team headed by my friend Gunnar Halland, of University of Bergen. And I also had a grant from the Ford Foundation to spend some time in Yunnan, southwest China, on problems related to deforestation and so forth. But then I got a call from a former student of mine who's working with Worldwide Fund for Nature in Jakarta, that they had some money for work on causes of forest fires, and would I be interested? And I go into a little detail about this because I had no previous interest in causes of forest fires. But that made the subject interesting to me. The question was specifically on causes, and forest fires. That was something I knew nothing about, and here was an opportunity to learn something about it. So I did go to Nepal for 2 weeks, but I cut the work in China to 1 month from 2, and I spent 2 months looking at causes of forest fires in Kalimantan, East Kalimantan. Well, I'm not sure just how many hectares were damaged in East Kalimantan. I don't have the figures offhand, but in East Kalimantan and Sumatra together, there were 6 million hectares of forests which were damaged. These were serious fires. And we published a report on that in '99, but it wasn't until 2006 that I published a paper in Human Ecology, which gives my considered views about how research on the causes of forest fires in Indonesia should proceed, successes that research has had, and ways in which the research has failed because of failures in the methodology and logic whereby the research was conducted. So I think that paper and several others published recently reflect fairly where my current interests lie, and very different from the systems stuff of the 60s and so on.
Mm-hmm. You talked a few times about problems with disciplinary boundaries.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about something that might touch on that. I wonder how you see your relationship with the discipline of anthropology today, and maybe how that's changed over time.
Do I have to? Well, I have a significant relationship, although I feel that in some ways I've left the discipline of anthropology, in that much of that goes on in anthropology doesn't really interest me.
Mm-hmm.
Very much. I'm not sure I should be saying this for this series of interviews, but that is the truth of it. And it's not so much that I've moved away from anthropology, although no doubt that's part of it, but also anthropology has moved away from me. However, I would go into this at all, except for the fact that I think the work I'm doing is for anthropologists and social scientists in related disciplines like cultural and political geographers. My recent writings on methodology, for example, the last chapter of the book Against the Grain, which came out in 2008, published by Altamira Press. That's the extent of the plug. I'll let potential readers find out for themselves the subtitle of the book. That last chapter gives methodological do's and don'ts for what I hope would be anthropologists and geographers. It's a chapter which I think is most intelligible to philosophers or the philosophically inclined, rather than to the majority of anthropologists. But however, I hope to improve my ability to communicate and get some of the things I'm saying across to anthropologists and geographers. Get across, it certainly sound a little arrogant. I hope to open up discussion with those folk, more communication about the questions I'm raising, about how research should be done, how questions should be formulated, and so forth. So there is a relation to anthropology, and for me it's a hopeful one. That it's one, in other words, it's one that I think will bring us closer together in the future if I live longer. Does that make sense?
I know that's a complex chapter, but I wonder what advice, I guess, you'd have for my third-year students in anthropology at Mount Allison.
Oh, I communicate well with third-year students, better than with full-grown anthropologists, because the ideas in the chapter are fairly simple ones. They're ideas like, if you're doing research, know what you're doing research about, have clear questions that you're asking, be specific in the questions, keep focused on the questions. Well, that's fairly straightforward. There is also some advice in it contrary to conventional advice. For example, that you don't need to start out with a theoretical framework. Rather than having one theoretical framework, it's good to know about lots of different theories. But one of the papers cited in that chapter is a paper which I say should be read by every graduate student and professor in North America, well, in the world maybe, interested in these subjects. And I say that following someone named John Platt, who published, I think it's John, it's Platt, published an article on this article that I'm about to refer to in Science in the 1960s. The paper is a paper by the geologist T.C. Chamberlain, first published in 1890, and called A Method of Multiple Working Hypotheses. And the idea is not to go out in the field to test one hypothesis or one theory, but to have a question to which there may be, to which no doubt there are lots of different possible answers. And the more different possible answers you're aware of, the better. So you need lots of knowledge, but the knowledge can never be comprehensive. You have as much knowledge as practically possible of possible answers, and then you decide which of those are worth further empirical scrutiny. And then you go about subjecting those to further empirical scrutiny. Whether the question is causes of forest fires or causes of particular violent outbreaks, or causes of using the land one way or using it another, using it to for oil palm plantations or using it for growing rice, etc., etc. I could go on with this, but that gives you an idea.
So now that you've gotten into some work on forest fires, is that an area that you're going to continue in?
Well, in some ways, yes. I may join a panel at the, what is it, I think the World Congress of Environmental History in Copenhagen next summer, the summer of 2009, on that. And there may also be a panel at the World Forestry Congress in Argentina in 2009. But this would be a way of just reporting on work already done. And forest fires aren't an area I'm especially interested in continuing to do work on. And I think that may say something about how I get involved in things. I like to get involved in things from which I can learn something new. And I'm sure there's much more to be known about forest fires than I can ever know. But my curiosity about them has been satisfied for the time being, and I'd like to get into new areas. So I'm exploring things like the effect of climate change on wine production and biological corridors in Central America and various other topics. This may say something in general about continuity of my interests. There's a continuity, at least in recent decades, in taking on topics where there's a challenge, this challenge for understanding and explanation. But, and I don't believe in giving superficial answers, but at some point my own curiosity about a particular subject is satisfied, and then I'd like to move on to learn about something new. And I hope I can continue to do that as long as I'm able to continue to do research.
Thanks very much.